Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are watching this webinar. Thank you for joining me. My name is Ian Gotts. I work for Elements.cloud, and I want to spend some time talking about developing in production. Is it inspired or insane? I must admit, this is one topic that's raised a huge level of interest and some very strong opinions on both sides. I'm branded as a heretic. Why you couldn't possibly develop in production? Everybody has to go through a sandbox. And the question is, well, is that really true? Now, before we go forward, I'm not suggesting that we are developing everything in production, but we need to take a balanced view. So with all webinars, there will be a recording of this sent out to you plus the deck. If you want to ask any questions, pop those in the chat and I'll try and answer those at the end. So this is all about risk and reward. Excuse me. We have a certain level of risk associated with every change we make, and we need to make sure that we balance the development effort associated with those risks. So I'm not suggesting that everything gets developed in production, but the concern I have is that many changes don't necessarily need the rigor of a full development lifecycle, and therefore we're wasting time and money. And if we look at this image here, maybe our high risk developments go through a development sandbox, then test in an IT integration sandbox, and then deploy into production. Maybe if we could identify medium level risks, they only need to be developed in the sandbox and go straight into production. But low-level risks could go straight into production. And the benefit of that obviously is higher frequency releases, shorter lead times, ideally lower failure rate, fewer releases that bounce and have to be taken back out again. And then we're more responsive to the business because we can put changes in more frequently. And we've set up here, maybe it takes 4 weeks is your standard dev cycle, monthly releases. Maybe if it were weekly, medium, we could do them weekly. But actually, if they were low, maybe we could put them in the same day. Now, we've adopted this approach internally inside Elements, and we're putting about 40 change requests through a week. Now, not all of those are low risk, but what we've identified doing sufficient impact analysis is that nearly 50% of the changes we're putting through are low risk. And that's actually generating a level of agility in our business. And also a level of engagement with our end users who are seeing suggestions and recommendations being put into the Salesforce org relatively quickly. So with all of these opportunities, we need to understand what the business benefits are, where, as it says there, show me the money. So let's take a simple example, a low risk example in my terms. So we're going to remove 10 unused fields from a page layout to make it simpler and cleaner. Let's think it's the opportunity page layout. We're going to add 2 validation rules to improve data quality. And we're going to add help on 20 fields to improve the people's understanding. So this is all about simplifying the UI for our sales teams. And all of those could be considered low risk, but because they involve changes to the org, maybe we have a monthly release cycle. So therefore it's going to take a month to go through using the old model versus a day if we use the new model I'm going to talk about. So if we look at the loaded costs of, say, admins, testers, salespeople, and look at their day rate, it's they're $31 for an admin and a tester, and the sales are $125 an hour. Now, if you just look at the development savings, so not putting all these changes through sandbox, having to go through building a sandbox, building a change set to move them from into the sandbox, then moving them into UAT, then moving into production, we're saving $375 for each one of these releases that goes through. And you say to me, Ian, that's fantastic, but why did he get me on a webinar to talk about $375? That's the savings for the development side. But when we start thinking about the benefits to the business, if we think that every salesperson, it's 2 minutes faster because we've got rid of some fields, we've added some help, we've done some validation rules, and they look at that screen 5 times a day, say it's the opportunity page, and we have 100 people in the sales team, and we can implement that in a day, not wait 30 days, the benefits there are $62,500. So these changes are not about making development a little bit more effective. Clearly that is a benefit, but the real benefits are in terms of increased agility of the organization. And in the current environment with COVID, business transformation is being brought to the fore. People are talking about business transformation being done in 5 weeks or 5 months rather than 5 years. But the real issue around COVID is none of us really know what the new business model is going to look like. So over the coming months, we're going to be constantly iterating our business model to make it right. To do that, we need the supporting systems, Salesforce, to be just as agile as the business is. And therefore, the whole of this concept of developing more quickly and enabling the systems to change more quickly, which means the business can change more quickly, that's where the real benefits are. And it hasn't been now is the time when it's going to be most important. So there is a real business benefit in starting to think about a risk-based approach to releases. So there are two actions. One is obviously looking at the risk, the other is looking at the development side. So let's first of all look at how we would actually understand or manage the risk of any release. So if we think of a release as made up of a series of user stories, and each user story has a series of changes, metadata item changes that are associated with them, maybe process changes associated with a user story. With no analysis, we have to assume that every risk is high risk. I mean, every one of us, I'm sure, has an example where we made a change which we thought was fairly simple, that had no real knock-on effects, and it blows up in our face. At that one field, I think one of my favorite all confessions is 707. Someone said I deleted one field which affected a ton of dashboards and reports and wasted 2 weeks of my life. And the moment as admins, developers or consultants we make those changes and have those problems, we're never going to do that again. We're always going to err on the side of safety. So if we have no visibility of the real impact of any change, we've got to assume they're all high risk, and therefore every single one of them obviously has to go through that high risk development cycle. 3 steps, taking maybe a month. But what if we could change that? What if we could have a different picture of that release, where we could look at each user story and really understand the risk associated with each user story? So in the picture here, we've now got 4 user stories, but I can see that user story 1 is low risk because the changes associated with are low risk. User story is high risk because there's one change in there which is high risk. User story is medium because there are 2 items that are medium. User story 4 is low risk because there's a low risk item. So we take a very simple approach here. We take the highest risk level of any item. So as user story 2 has got 1 item in that's high risk, that story must be high risk. Therefore, the whole release must be high risk. So even in this picture, even though we can see that there are low risk user stories there, we still have to take the whole of this release through the high risk approach because one item in there is forced it to be high risk. But now we've got this information, maybe we could change the makeup of the release. Maybe we could pull out over here, maybe we could pull out that change out of user story 2 if it didn't affect it. Suddenly we've reduced that overall user story to medium, which means the whole release is medium. Or maybe we just pull out the whole user story. Or even better, maybe we just make the release user story 1 and user story 4, and suddenly the release is now low risk. So this ability to understand the risk of a release based on the user story risk means that we can start to make some different decisions about the way we make up a release. And therefore we can group them differently. Maybe we can make the releases smaller, so we can actually drive more of those releases through the low risk cycle. So this all hinges on us understanding what risk is. So the way we assess the risk is that we look at risk from basically in this matrix. We look at the impact of the release. In this case, a user story is made up of releases. So we look at the impact of a user story, and it's based on technical impact, operational impact, and regulatory impact. And then we look down here at the complexity eye, how many changes that we need to make to Salesforce. And again, we take a view about low, medium, and high. And then based on the combination of those two, we decide whether it's a low, medium, or high risk user story, and therefore we decide what development path to take it in. So let's have a look at how we do this impact assessment. So we use Elements. Elements has an automated data dictionary that gets built every night, and updated every night, and it pulls out all the metadata, but it also does all the automated analysis for us. So it's looking at every metadata item and it's building an analysis picture. So here you can see we're looking at a budget field, and on the right-hand side, it's telling us how, if this field is completed by record type, then also it's telling us where it's used. It's used in 5 page layouts, 2 process builder workflows, and so on. It's looking at, I think, 15 different places for where that field is used. And that right-hand panel with those insights are also delivered inside Salesforce Setup, also inside Capado, and inside a page layout. So there are different places that you can look when you're starting to do that impact analysis. We're providing that analysis, inserting it or injecting it into those page layouts. So that's the single level. Is the field populated and where's it used? But the other thing we need to understand is what's the knock-on effect. If I change that field, where else is that used? And we have the idea of a multi-level view. And we use the dependency analysis as the dependency API, the impact analysis, and our own impact analysis code to build out this tree. And you can see here that it starts in this case with one field. I can click on any of the items with a plus sign, which expands it and expands it and expands it. I can click on any item and I can see that in setup. So now we're getting a far clearer picture of the impact assessment of any particular metadata item. I don't think it would be possible to take this approach if you hadn't had this level of automation. To try and build this picture would be a nightmare, bouncing around setup, trying to build some Excel spreadsheet. And of course, that Excel spreadsheet is immediately out of date the moment any changes have been made. So you have to do the analysis again. So we are doing this analysis for you every night when we synchronize that org, which enables you to obviously get a far clearer picture of the impact of any changes. So that's thinking about the technical aspects of the impact. The other side of the technical impact is obviously thinking about what documentation you've added. So maybe you haven't created much documentation yet, but something I would encourage you to do as you're doing your development. Again, in this right panel, you can then start to add documentation, and that could be links to notes, just a quick note, either added inside here in setup or using our mobile app, just dictate some notes. It could be a link to a URL, could be a specification, link to a screenshot, you could embed an image, links to your requirements and user stories, or link to process diagrams. So as you start to build up the documentation associated with changes, again, you're adding to the your impact analysis and making that assessment easier. Now, I understand that for many of you, there isn't very much documentation. So therefore, the first cycle around your implementation lifecycle is your chance to add some of that documentation. But again, it doesn't have to be huge, like 10-page documents. It could be some simple notes just explaining why you've done something in a certain way. I mean, as you're doing your detective work, this is where you can basically post the evidence. To think about the operational and the regulatory impact of any changes, you may need to look at the process. So the operational processes. Now, again, you may not have many process diagrams drawn. If you have, fantastic. If not, then obviously Elements is a way of starting to map those business processes. using a very simple approach called UPN. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it now, but it's UPN is a principle that's been around for about 20 years. It's basically a notation for drawing diagrams that are relatively easy for everyone in the organization to understand. And the whole concept is it's a multi-level. Any one of these with a corner on means you can drive down to a lower level of detail and down and down and down. But from an operational perspective, understanding the impact of changes are going to have on the operation, these diagrams are really valuable. And of course, you can link that back to the metadata items or to your user stories. The same is true for regulatory impact analysis. If we make these changes, what regulations are we likely to break? And again, you can look at the process diagrams to start to think about that from a regulatory perspective. And there's some other capabilities around privacy inside Elements that will support you in doing that. So that was assessing the risk. The other side is we need to streamline our development processes. If you have just one straight-through process, which is all around a high-risk process, we need to reevaluate that and identify whether there are some shortcuts or some more streamlined approaches for both medium and low development life cycles. So let's look at how we would streamline the development side. Many of you have seen this diagram. A number of companies in the ecosystem are now using it. It's the whole implementation life cycle, the whole concept of you do your analysis work, which is capturing requirements, mapping processes, doing some org impact analysis, and then building your user stories. So that's really what I've just been talking about. This is this whole analysis piece. But when we get into our build cycle, configure, code, document, test, that's where we can start to streamline the processes to make sure that we are applying the right level of rigor and risk mitigation associated with the risk for each user story. Obviously, the deployment and release, again, those processes will be slightly different based on high, medium, and low. In terms of the operate phase, obviously that's how the end users will be using the applications you've built. But a critical step here is the training and feedback, because that feedback is how we then feed back into the analyze phase. And the whole issue here is about how do we go around this cycle more quickly? How do we make sure we build the right apps, the ones that the end users really want, not the ones they thought they needed, so we drive up adoption. But then how do we go around this cycle quickly to drive up agility? But most importantly, we have a level of trust here that we're not going to break anything as we go around that cycle. So this is obviously a schematic. We've actually documented our development processes in terms of those 4 different areas. The good news is, excuse me, the good news is that we've created these process maps and made them freely available, and anybody can use them, copy them, modify them. Now, they're not going to be perfect for your operation, but they are at least a great starting point, so you can start to reuse some of the knowledge that we've built up over maybe the last 20 years of using Salesforce, and probably in my case about 30 years of documenting processes. So a great starting point, anybody can use them and download them. So we think about the 4 phases: analyze changes, build and document the changes, deploy them and operate. And every one of these, as you can see, has a drill down. Let's just pick any. You can see here is a lower level diagram. This is about how this is a high risk approach. This is the medium risk approach. And then this is the low risk approach. And then you can see that several of these have more drill downs. They have links to attached documents. So there's quite a wealth of resource here that we've, from our experience, that we've made available to all of you. Now that was a very quick sprint through those cycles. I mean, the obvious answer is, well, yes, what do I do? How do I get going? There is a free trial. That free trial enables you to synchronize production or sandboxes. It will take 2 minutes to get set up. It will take probably between 20 minutes and a couple of hours to do all of that analysis. And it will then start to give you all that impact analysis that I showed you. Then in terms of streamlining your development, again, that user account you get will enable you to access the process mapping capabilities inside Elements. It will also give you access to those process maps that we've already created, so you can start thinking about how you improve your development cycle. One point here, that from 30 years of mapping processes, the act of you streamlining your development cycle, not only will it mean that you end up with a faster cycle for some of those different low risk user stories, but you'll probably drive out up to 25% in savings, because you're just identifying a better way of working. So don't underestimate just the impact of mapping out your operational processes. And it's not just the development cycle. Those process maps we've shown you are all 4 steps. It is the analyze phase, how we do analysis, how we do build, how we do develop, and then how we do operate. So if you have questions, then ping me an email or go to success@elements.cloud. So I'm very happy to take any questions.